I'm Mark Merrill, and this is my presentation on the cost of justice or lifetime sentences of invisible punishments. So the problem that I saw was that the demography of U.S. jails and prison at the county and state level is disproportionately made up of people lacking property, position, and power, or basically that the system is treating poor people more harshly than it is everybody else. There's a correlative relationship between poverty and incarceration, and the poor are more likely to encounter discriminatory practices throughout the adjudicatory process from beginning to end. So like Captain Lewis here, I came from a law enforcement background, and this bothers me. I saw that between crimes that are characteristically committed by poor people and crimes that are characteristically committed by the well-off, the system will treat the crimes committed by the poor people much more harshly than it does the crimes committed by the well-off, even when the crimes of the well-off take more money from the public or cause more death and injury than the crimes of the poor. Eidson and Johnson did a wonderful article on that. There's a price paid by the poor. It comes in monetary and social costs. It ranges from the fines and fees that we charge. Looking at Idaho code, those range anywhere from $10 for your not wearing a seatbelt ticket to $126.50 for failure to have insurance, $150 for an excessive speeding ticket, and then fees associated with that. So if you don't have insurance, you might be required to get an SR22, which is a higher level of insurance, and you're going to be paying more for that. Crimes that go up to the misdemeanor level carry jail time and up to $1,000 in fines as established by the court. Then there's restitution amounts, which I'll talk about here in a minute, and suspensions that come as other forms of punishment. You lose your driver's license, and then the etc., meaning that the judge has some room there to decide some other punishments, what he's going to do as part of your sentencing. Punitive measures like jail time and license suspensions can increase the economic burden on the offender, and that burden's been called a significant economic burden with no resources in sight. So I mentioned restitution. It's actually required by U.S. Code as a condition for parole or for release. And the defendant will submit their financial info. However, the judge can order restitution in amounts that are well above an offender's ability to repay. There's also restitution that can be required for victimless crimes, like a drug crime, where restitution can be charged for the time that the officer spent doing his paperwork and conducting the investigation for the field kit that he used to test the drugs. The victim of that crime really, if any, is society, and society through taxes is already paid for all of those items that now are being charged as restitution towards the suspect. Then court-appointed counsel. This one's pretty controversial. We learned that in Gideon versus Wainwright, there can be no equal justice if a poor man has to face his accusers without a lawyer to help represent him. This seems fair. It seems like a move in the right direction, that our system is acknowledging that. However, some jurisdictions will actually require you to repay your court-appointed counsel as part of the conditions of your release. There's a split on it now, where the 5th and the 9th circuits have ruled against it, and the 1st and the 7th circuits have ruled to still allow it. And then there's those in between that still haven't made a ruling. So depending on where you live, you might actually be required to make your restitution payment for your court-appointed counsel, which was appointed to you because you couldn't afford it in the first place. So restitution and fines place clear financial burdens on offenders, and an especially disproportionate burden on the poor offenders. The rich can afford it. The well-off might be an inconvenience, but they can afford it. It's the poor that are actually paying for it because they can't afford it. There's additional invisible punishments that come from that, like being required to have regular meetings with a parole officer, being required to attend programs, being required to submit to random drug testing, and being required to either hold a job or actively be looking for one, all of which have some sort of cost of either transportation, attire, or cost of the program itself. And then there's the additional strain that's going to be placed on the family as one or more of the parents is removed and incarcerated, or they have to deal with getting someone to and from a program, to and from meetings, limited contact with family based on their criminal history, a lot more strain that can actually perpetuate a cycle, especially in a poor or lower class neighborhood. Without financial resources, it's nearly impossible for offenders to comply with all the conditions of their release. So we've seen a transition away from the original goals of what parole was supposed to be. Historically, the goals of probation and parole was to rehabilitate. It was to be done through employment, and evidence actually shows that offenders who have employment have lower recidivism rates. Parole was created by legislation clear back in 1910, over 100 years ago, and details tell the job of a parole officer to include helping find employment as well as supervising the offender. But now there's a cyclic recidivism pattern that comes from technical violations. So you have an offender that's charged with a crime ranging from anything from a DUI up. So we take that DUI, for example, and he's going to experience a mandatory license suspension. He's going to experience fines and fees associated with the crime itself, some jail time. He might be given credit for time served, might be put into a treatment program, and we'll probably see some level of probation. He's going to have supervision costs and fees, fines associated with that, and have to pay most likely for impound on his vehicle, and then he could lose his job. He faces the stigma that comes with being labeled as a drunk driver and things like that. So that offender is repeatedly penalized for the same thing over and over again. Failure to pay a fine or restitution is rarely the sole reason that a probation or parole officer has listed for revoking parole, but it's remarkable how often it is listed as a reason for seeking that revocation. More than half of those that are returning to prison for a violation of a condition of their release aren't returning for new crimes, but they're actually returning for technical violations. Inmates know what they're up against, and in a recent survey, they found that they did not feel that they would have difficulty complying with conditions of release that required them to work 20 hours a week, or basically a part-time job, pay a $100 fine, or complete 10 hours of community service every week, or 40 hours a month of community service. But they notably felt that paying a $500 fine, paying a $20 per week supervision fee, and being under something like house arrest would be some of the most challenging conditions that they'd have to meet. So the true problem then is that the role that poverty plays in the violation of release conditions and recidivism is often overlooked by policymakers and especially by parole boards. So there's a call for a shift in thinking and a change in that paradigm to alternative sentencing, which is the most effective method for stemming the proliferation of jails and prisons in the United States. Coven found 12 alternatives that proved to be pretty successful, and they included diversion programs, deferred sentencing, drug courts, restorative justice programs, home detention, weekend jail, work release, community service sentences, electronic monitoring, sober living environments, day reporting centers, intensive supervision programs. And of those, weekend jail and work release was one of my favorites. It allowed an opportunity to work and get ahead rather than be buried by additional unpayable debt. You're either spending your weekend in jail and have the rest of your week free to work, or you're spending all of your time in jail but being released to go to work. Either way, it's available while you're in jail and while you're awaiting sentencing. Coven witnessed in his experience inmates lose employment and property only to later be released or to be found not guilty. Nonviolent offenders sentenced for nonviolent crimes are actually better served through alternative sentencing. The next is community service. It first started showing up in the 1960s, and it's probably the most underused alternative sanction in the U.S. Inmates, as indicated in that study, feel capable of completing it up to 20 hours and serves to connect offenders to their community, which can actually help reduce recidivism. They found that program completion is key to the success, and it's often a misused tool in the U.S., simply used to reduce overcrowding in the prison population instead of what it's designed to do. Buford and Muftik found that there were benefits as a standalone sanction like in Europe, where instead of a fine or a fee, you get community service. The next was the restorative justice model, which I'm a big fan of. It's intended to aid in understanding the impact of harm. It works for the offender, the community, and oftentimes the victim, and it allows reparation without monetary cost. There can be justice met without overstressing a family's financial situation. The next was the halfway house. There was increased use of parole sparked by the tremendous growth in prison populations that actually increased the use of parole 350% since the 1980s, and I can only imagine that parole violations have increased along with it. It's similar to a sober living environment in that it's both custodial and therapeutic. You're required to check in and out, and there's a therapy aspect. It showed marked success when done with proper screening, and it allows the offender to receive treatment while they're in the community and preparing for that transition from inmate to citizen. The last and my most favorite was the post-release job programs. I saw there was a common theme across all the problems and solutions that I read, and that was employment. The single most effective factor in reducing reoffending is found to be employment, and the biggest concern for recently released inmates is finding a job. It's also required as part of your probation or your parole. 14 states will revoke your parole for failure to either keep or be actively finding a job. In 1997, there were 28,000 inmates that reported their parole was revoked for that reason alone. Conditions of release and employment requirements often become mutually exclusive. They get in the way of each other, and yet they're required simultaneously. So my conclusion is that the current system is more punitive than it is rehabilitative. The correctional spending is exceeding $50 billion a year, and it's not well spent. It's not spent to correct, it's spent to punish. The average cost to house someone in jail was $22,000 a year, where a drug treatment program was $12,000 to $14,000 a year. So it's markedly less expensive, but also it's an investment in that the money spent on the treatment program is likely not going to be continuously spent, whereas the money spent to keep someone in jail, warehousing a person, is going to be spent every year for the rest of that person's life. In Douglas versus California, another landmark case that came out at the same time as Gidding versus Wainwright, was found as part of the ruling that there can be no equal justice where justice depends on the amount of money that a person has. That was and still is a hope that has not been fully realized by our system today. And criminal justice policies disparately target poor communities. The real culprit of our failing criminal justice system is the social condition that we face in poverty.